Tonight, we journey back to November 20th, 1980, when a drilling rig on a peaceful Louisiana lake suddenly began tilting violently as the water beneath it started spiraling downward like a bathtub drain, pulling everything into a growing whirlpool of destruction. We're about to explore one of the most bizarre and terrifying disasters in American history, the day an entire lake was swallowed by the earth, taking barges, drilling rigs, and acres of land with it. Yet somehow, miraculously, everyone lived to tell the tale. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. If you're joining from the United States, perhaps late in the evening, or from Europe, where morning light might be breaking, or from anywhere else in the world, no matter the time, this story will wait for you, unfolding slowly, gently, like the peaceful waters of a lake on a quiet morning. Don't forget to like this story, subscribe if you enjoy these historical journeys, and share a comment. Maybe tell us where you're watching from and what disasters fascinate you most. Now prepare yourself. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your mind wander back more than 4 decades as we step quietly into southern Louisiana, to a place where beneath calm waters, an unimaginable catastrophe was waiting to unfold. In the heart of Iberia Parish, Louisiana, nestled among cypress swamps and sugarcane fields, there existed a body of water known as Lake Peigneur. It was not a grand lake by any measure, not like the vast expanses of the Great Lakes up north, nor the sprawling reservoirs of the west. Lake Peigneur was modest, almost humble in its dimensions. The lake stretched across roughly 1,300 acres, its waters typically no deeper than 10 feet, shallow enough that on sunny days you could sometimes see straight through to the muddy bottom below. The lake had a certain charm about it, the kind that locals appreciated but outsiders rarely noticed. Spanish moss draped from cypress trees along its banks, swaying gently in the humid breeze that drifted up from the Gulf of Mexico, just miles to the south. The water itself was fresh, fed by rainfall and runoff from the surrounding farmland, and it provided a peaceful spot for weekend fishermen who would sit in small boats, lines cast out, waiting for bass or catfish to bite. Around the lake's perimeter, life moved at the unhurried pace common to rural Louisiana. Sugarcane fields stretched out in orderly rows, their tall stalks rustling softly in the wind. On the northern shore sat Jefferson Island, a slight elevation in the otherwise flat landscape, home to beautiful gardens and a grand plantation home that dated back to the 1800s. The gardens were particularly lovely, carefully maintained with camellias, azaleas, and live oaks that had stood for over a century, their massive branches creating canopies of shade. The people who lived and worked around Lake Peigneur knew it intimately. They knew where the best fishing spots were, which areas to avoid because the mud was too thick, and how the lake would sometimes rise after heavy rains, spreading out across the lowlands before receding back to its normal boundaries. It was predictable, reliable, unchanging. Generation after generation of families had grown up beside these waters, and there was a comfortable familiarity in that constancy. On the surface, Lake Peigneur appeared to be nothing more than what it seemed, a shallow, peaceful body of water surrounded by farmland and swamp. But beneath those calm waters, hidden from view and largely unknown to most who fished or boated above, lay something entirely different. Something vast, something ancient, and something that would soon become the center of one of the strangest disasters America had ever witnessed. The lake sat atop an underground salt dome, a massive geological formation that had been slowly rising through the earth for millions of years. These salt domes are common along the Gulf Coast, giant pillars of salt that push upward through layers of sedimentary rock, sometimes breaking through to the surface, sometimes remaining hidden below. The one beneath Lake Peigneur was particularly large, and for decades it had been mined extensively for the valuable salt it contained. But on that quiet morning in November 1980, with mist rising from the water's surface and birds calling from the cypress trees, Lake Peigneur looked exactly as it always had: peaceful, shallow, ordinary. No one could have imagined that before the day was done, this unremarkable lake would make headlines across the nation, and that its very existence would be transformed beyond all recognition. The water lay still and quiet, reflecting the gray sky above, and beneath it, 300 feet down in tunnels carved from solid salt, miners were beginning another ordinary workday, completely unaware of what the next few hours would bring. To understand what happened at Lake Peigneur, one must first venture downward, away from the sunlight and the fresh air, deep into the earth where darkness reigns, and the only light comes from headlamps and electric bulbs strung along tunnel walls. Here, 300 feet beneath the lake's muddy bottom, the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine had operated for over 50 years, a vast underground complex carved directly from one of nature's most unusual geological formations. The mine was not what most people imagine when they think of mining. There were no cramped, claustrophobic tunnels requiring men to crawl on their hands and knees. Instead, the chambers of the Diamond Crystal Mine were surprisingly spacious, some with ceilings that soared 30 feet high or more. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all pure salt, gleaming white in the artificial light, crystalline and smooth where the mining equipment had cut through the ancient deposits. Walking through these tunnels was a strange experience. The air was cool and dry, lacking the humidity that saturated the Louisiana landscape above. The temperature stayed constant year-round, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable enough that miners wore only light clothing as they worked. The salt absorbed moisture from the air, keeping the tunnels remarkably dry despite being hundreds of feet underground and, though no one thought about it much, directly beneath a body of water. The mine sprawled across a vast area underground, a maze of interconnected chambers and passageways that extended in all directions from the central shaft. Miners had been excavating salt here since 1919, using room and pillar mining techniques that left massive columns of salt standing to support the ceiling. These pillars, each several feet thick, marched away into the darkness like sentries in an underground cathedral. The work was steady and relatively safe as mining operations go. Men operated drilling equipment to bore holes into the salt faces, loaded explosives to break away large sections, and used mechanical loaders to gather the broken salt and transport it to crushers. From there, conveyor belts carried the crushed salt to the main shaft, where it was hoisted to the surface, processed, and eventually shipped out to be used in everything from food preparation to chemical manufacturing to de-icing winter roads. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company employed around 50 men at any given time, working in shifts to keep the mine operational around the clock. These were local men mostly, from small towns around Iberia Parish, men who had worked in the mine for years or even decades. They knew every tunnel, every chamber, every quirk of the underground system. They understood the rhythms of the work, the sounds of the machinery, the feeling of the salt walls around them. Safety was taken seriously. The mine had an excellent safety record, with few serious accidents in its long history. Emergency procedures were practiced regularly. Escape routes were clearly marked. Multiple exits existed in case the main shaft became blocked. The miners trusted the company, trusted the engineers who designed the tunnels, and trusted the solid salt walls that surrounded them. What they didn't fully understand, what perhaps no one fully understood, was exactly how those tunnels related to the surface features above. Mining operations had gradually expanded over the decades, with new chambers excavated in different directions as older areas were exhausted. The mine sprawled beneath Jefferson Island, beneath farmland, and beneath a portion of Lake Peigneur itself. The ceiling of the mine, the layer of rock and soil that separated the salt caverns from the world above, varied in thickness. In some areas, several hundred feet of dense rock provided a thick protective barrier. In other areas, particularly beneath the lake, the ceiling was thinner, perhaps only 100 feet or so of mixed salt, limestone, and sediment. It was solid enough, the engineers assured everyone. The lake had been there for generations. The mine for over 50 years. They coexisted peacefully, one atop the other, with no problems. On the morning of November 20th, 1980, the day shift miners reported for work as usual. They gathered near the main shaft, checking equipment, discussing the day's assignments, sharing coffee and conversation in the cool underground air. Some would be drilling in the northern sections. Others would be loading and hauling in the western chambers. Maintenance crews would be checking equipment and repairing any issues that had developed during the night shift. The mine was quiet, except for the distant hum of ventilation fans and the occasional echo of voices or machinery from deep in the tunnels. The great salt pillars stood silent, bearing the weight of all that earth and water above. And somewhere above their heads, on the surface of the lake, an oil drilling rig was about to make a terrible mistake. Above the lake, in the early morning hours of November 20th, a very different kind of operation was underway. The Wilson Brothers Corporation, an oil and gas drilling company, had set up a drilling rig on the surface of Lake Peigneur. The rig stood on a platform floating on the shallow water, a tall derrick rising into the gray sky, drilling equipment humming and clanking as it worked steadily, probing the earth far below the lake bottom. Oil and gas exploration was nothing new to Louisiana. The state sat atop some of the richest petroleum deposits in the nation, and for decades, companies had been drilling wells throughout the region, both on land and in the shallow waters of lakes, swamps, and coastal areas. Lake Peigneur was just another location among thousands, another spot where geologists believed there might be oil trapped in the ancient rock layers deep underground. The drilling rig itself was a standard piece of equipment for such operations. The derrick towered about 100 feet above the water, housing the drilling mechanism that would bore down through layers of sediment, limestone, sand, and whatever else lay beneath the lake. The drill bit, 14 inches in diameter, was attached to a long string of drill pipe that rotated as it cut deeper and deeper into the earth. Drilling is a slow, methodical process. The bit grinds away at the rock, while drilling mud, a specially formulated fluid, is pumped down through the hollow drill pipe. This mud serves several purposes, cooling the bit, carrying away the rock cuttings, and helping to stabilize the walls of the hole as it gets deeper. The mud and cuttings then flow back up to the surface around the outside of the drill pipe, where the cuttings are filtered out so the mud can be recycled back down the hole. The Wilson Brothers crew had been drilling for several days, working their way down through the various geological layers. They were searching for what geologists call a pay zone, a layer of porous rock saturated with oil or natural gas that could be extracted profitably. The drill bit had already penetrated hundreds of feet below the lake bottom, passing through mud, sand, limestone, and other sedimentary layers. The drilling crew consisted of roughnecks, as they were commonly called, experienced men who understood the equipment and the process. They monitored gauges, listened to the sounds of the machinery, and watched for any signs of trouble. The driller, the man who controlled the drilling operation from the control panel, had to balance multiple factors: the weight on the bit, the rotation speed, the flow of drilling mud, and the rate of penetration through the rock. On the morning of November 20th, the drilling was proceeding normally. The bit was down around 1,200 feet below the surface of the lake, still searching for that elusive pay zone. The crew worked through the early morning darkness, the rig lights illuminating the drilling platform, while the lake stretched out around them, black and still in the pre-dawn hours. What the drilling crew didn't fully understand, what perhaps even the company geologists didn't completely appreciate, was exactly what lay beneath them at that particular location. They had maps and surveys, of course. They knew about the salt dome underground. They knew about the diamond crystal salt mine and its extensive tunnel system. But the exact three-dimensional relationship between the drill hole they were boring and the mine chambers below was not perfectly clear. Drilling in areas above or near underground mines is always risky. The mine creates large voids underground, and if a drill hole inadvertently penetrates into one of those voids, the results can be catastrophic. For this reason, drilling companies are supposed to obtain detailed maps of any mining operations in the area and carefully plot their drill holes to avoid intersecting with mine tunnels. In this case, there was apparently a mistake in the calculations. Perhaps the maps were imprecise. Perhaps the coordinates were recorded incorrectly. Perhaps someone miscalculated the angle of the drill hole as it deviated from vertical during its descent. Whatever the reason, the drill bit, as it ground deeper into the earth that morning, was heading directly toward one of the mine's tunnels. At approximately 3 a.m., give or take a few minutes, the drill bit punched through the ceiling of the mine. It wasn't a gentle contact. The rotating bit, designed to grind through solid rock, encountered the salt and sediment layer that formed the mine's ceiling and cut straight through it. In an instant, a 14-inch diameter hole connected the bottom of Lake Peigneur directly to the tunnel system of the diamond crystal salt mine 300 feet below. At first, the drilling crew noticed nothing unusual. The bit had simply penetrated into what felt like a softer layer, not uncommon when drilling through varied geological formations. But then things started to go wrong in ways that would quickly escalate from odd to alarming to absolutely terrifying. The first signs of trouble. The driller at the control panel was the first to notice something wasn't right. The drilling operation had been proceeding smoothly, the bit grinding steadily downward, when suddenly the instruments began showing strange readings. The weight on the bit changed unexpectedly. The torque on the drill pipe fluctuated oddly. The flow of drilling mud returning to the surface seemed different somehow. These were subtle signs, the kind that experienced drillers learn to recognize through years of work. Something had changed downhole, something in the interaction between the bit and the rock it was cutting through. The driller frowned, studying the gauges more closely, trying to interpret what the equipment was telling him. Then came a more obvious problem. The drilling crew noticed that the entire rig had begun to tilt. It was slight at first, barely perceptible, just a degree or two off level. But it was definitely tilting, and that was not normal at all. Drilling rigs are designed to remain perfectly level during operation. The platform they stood on should have been stable on the water's surface. One of the roughnecks walked to the edge of the platform and looked down at the water. What he saw made his blood run cold. The surface of Lake Peigneur, normally flat and still in the early morning calm, was beginning to swirl around the drilling platform. Not violently, not yet, but definitely moving in a circular pattern, as if something below was pulling the water downward. "Hey," He called out to the others, his voice tight with concern. "Y'all need to see this." The other crew members gathered at the platform's edge, looking down at the water. The swirling pattern was becoming more pronounced with each passing second. What had started as a gentle circulation was intensifying, the water moving faster, beginning to create a visible whirlpool around the rig's legs. The driller made a quick decision. Whatever was happening, it wasn't safe. "Shut it down," he ordered. "We're shutting down operations right now." The crew moved quickly to stop the drilling. The bits stopped rotating. The pumps that circulated the drilling mud were turned off, but the problems didn't stop. In fact, they were getting worse by the second. The rig tilted further, now noticeably leaning at an angle that made walking on the platform difficult. Equipment began sliding toward the low side. Tools that had been set down rolled across the deck. The groaning of stressed metal filled the air as the rig's structure responded to forces it was never designed to handle. Down in the water, the swirling had intensified into a genuine whirlpool. The lake's surface was rotating rapidly around the rig, pulling inward toward the center, and the crew could hear a sound that seemed to come from deep below, a rushing, roaring noise that grew louder with each moment. "We need to get off this rig," someone shouted. "We need to get off right now." The crew didn't need to be told twice. There was a small boat tied to the platform, used for transport between the rig and shore. Men scrambled toward it, abandoning their posts, leaving behind equipment and personal belongings, focused only on reaching safety. As they worked to untie the boat, one of the roughnecks looked back at the drill pipe extending down through the platform into the water. The entire string of pipe was vibrating now, shaking like a plucked guitar string, the metal singing with stress. Then, even as he watched, the pipe began to move. Not up or down in the normal way of drilling operations, but sideways, pulled by some immense force acting on the bit far below. "It's pulling the pipe down," he yelled. "The whole rig's going to go." They got the boat free and pushed off from the platform, 4 or 5 men crammed into a vessel designed for 2 or 3. They rowed frantically toward shore, which was perhaps 200 yards away, their arms burning with effort, not daring to look back. But they could hear what was happening behind them. The groaning of metal grew louder, accompanied by the rushing roar of water and a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the earth itself. The rig was tilting more and more steeply, its tall derrick leaning at an impossible angle. One of the men couldn't help himself. He looked back over his shoulder. The drilling rig, that massive structure of steel and iron that had stood perhaps 100 feet tall, was toppling over. It fell in what seemed like slow motion, the derrick leaning further and further until it crashed down toward the water with a tremendous splash and the screech of tearing metal. The platform beneath it buckled and broke apart, and then, in a sight that none of them would ever forget, the entire rig, hundreds of tons of equipment and machinery, began to be pulled down into the lake by the swirling water. It didn't sink gradually like a ship taking on water. It was dragged down, sucked beneath the surface by a force so powerful that it made the massive steel structure look like a toy boat going down a drain. Within seconds, the top of the derrick disappeared beneath the churning surface. Moments later, the last piece of the platform vanished. The drilling rig was simply gone, swallowed by Lake Peigneur, as if it had never existed. The men in the boat rowed even harder, their hearts pounding, not understanding what they had just witnessed, but knowing with absolute certainty that they needed to get to shore immediately. Behind them, the whirlpool was growing, expanding outward from where the rig had stood, the water spinning faster and faster, creating a vortex that was beginning to dominate the entire visible surface of the lake. They reached the shore and scrambled up onto dry land, panting, shaking, staring back at the lake in disbelief. The whirlpool continued to grow, now perhaps 100 yards across, the water rushing inward and downward with a roar that carried clearly across the distance. "What the hell is happening?" one of them managed to gasp. None of them had an answer, but whatever it was far from over. The mine evacuation. 300 feet underground, in the cool, dry tunnels of the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine, the miners were completely unaware of the catastrophe unfolding above them. They had no idea that a drilling rig had just punched a hole through the mine ceiling, or that lake water was now pouring into the tunnel system. The first indication that something was wrong came as a series of tremors. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a subtle vibration in the salt walls, the kind of thing that might have been mistaken for heavy equipment operating nearby. But the tremors intensified quickly, becoming more pronounced, and miners in different parts of the underground complex began to notice. Leonce Viator Jr., the mine foreman that morning, was in one of the working chambers when he felt the trembling in the salt beneath his feet. He paused, frowning, trying to identify what might be causing it. Mining operations did create vibrations, but this felt different, more sustained, coming from no particular direction, but seeming to emanate from the very walls themselves. Then he heard water. It was a faint sound at first, barely audible over the normal background noise of the mine, but it was definitely water, somewhere, echoing through the tunnels. That was extremely unusual. The mine was dry, had always been dry. There shouldn't be water down here. The sound grew louder, and with it came a new vibration, stronger than before. Somewhere, not too far away, something was happening. Viator made an immediate decision. He didn't know what was wrong, didn't have time to investigate, but his instincts told him that whatever was happening, it was serious. "Everybody out," he shouted to the men working in his section. "We're evacuating, right now. Leave everything and head for the shaft." The miners looked at him in surprise. Evacuations were rare, only called for genuine emergencies, but they saw the serious expression on the foreman's face and heard the urgency in his voice, and they didn't argue. Tools were dropped where they stood, lunch pails left on tunnel floors, equipment abandoned mid-operation. The men turned and began moving quickly toward the main shaft, their headlamps bobbing in the darkness. Viator grabbed a phone, one of the communication lines that connected different areas of the mine to the surface, and cranked the handle to alert the operators above. "We've got a problem down here," he reported quickly. "I'm evacuating everyone. Something's wrong, I can hear water, and the tunnels are shaking. Get everyone out of the mine now." He didn't wait for a response. He slammed the phone back into its cradle and began running through the tunnels, shouting for other work crews, spreading the evacuation order. His voice echoed through the salt chambers. "Everyone out! Evacuate! Get to the main! Shaft!" Other supervisors heard him and took up the call. Within minutes, miners throughout the underground complex were on the move, converging on the central shaft from different directions. Some had to travel from distant chambers, navigating through the maze of tunnels they knew by heart, their headlamps creating bouncing circles of light in the darkness as they ran. The main shaft was the primary means of access to the mine, a large vertical opening with 2 elevators that carried men and equipment between the surface and the underground. Under normal circumstances, the miners would gather at the shaft and wait their turn to ride the elevators up, an orderly process that would take perhaps 15 or 20 minutes to evacuate the entire workforce. But these were not normal circumstances. As men reached the shaft area, they could hear the water much more clearly now. It was a rushing, roaring sound that echoed through the tunnels from somewhere to the south. And the tremors had intensified into something that could almost be called shaking. A continuous vibration that made loose salt dust drift down from the ceiling. The elevators began running immediately, carrying load after load of miners to the surface. But they were slow, designed for reliability rather than speed, and some men looked at those elevators and made quick calculations. How long would it take to get everyone up? And how much time did they actually have? Several miners made a different choice. Near the main shaft were emergency escape ladders, long vertical climbs of several hundred feet, intended as backup routes in case the elevators failed. These ladders were rarely used, the climb exhausting and time-consuming. But some of the men, looking at the elevators and hearing that rushing water growing louder, decided not to wait. They began climbing, hand over hand, rung after rung, up through the vertical shaft. Their legs burned, their arms ached, but they climbed steadily, driven by the primal need to reach the surface, to get out of this hole in the ground while they still could. Down below, the last groups of miners were reaching the shaft. Foremen did quick head counts, checking off names, making sure everyone was accounted for. "Who's still down here?" Viator shouted. "Call out if you're here." The response came back from various points around the shaft. "We're all here from the north section. West chamber's clear. Everyone from the southern tunnels is out." The last elevator was loaded with men, packed tightly, far exceeding its normal capacity. The operator pulled the lever, and the cage began its slow ascent. Below them, in the tunnels they were leaving behind, the sound of water had become thunderous. Some of the miners swore they could see a mist beginning to form in the air, moisture that had no business being in these dry salt tunnels. The men climbing the emergency ladders were perhaps a third of the way up when they felt a new sensation, a change in air, pressure, as if something large was moving through the tunnels far below. The air in the shaft seemed to move, pushed by some force from underneath. The elevator continued upward, painfully slow, the men inside gripping the cage walls, staring up at the circle of daylight that marked the surface, still so far above them. They could hear water now, even in the elevator shaft, a deep rumbling roar that seemed to be growing closer. Then, finally, the elevator reached the surface. The men scrambled out, nearly falling in their haste, stumbling away from the shaft onto solid ground, into the open air, into safety. The last of the ladder climbers emerged moments later, exhausted, gasping, but alive. Foreman did a final count. 50 men had been in the mine that morning. 50 men were now on the surface. Everyone had made it out. But even as they celebrated that miraculous fact, they turned to look back at the mine entrance and realized that the disaster was far from over. The ground near the shaft was trembling, and from somewhere nearby came a sound like nothing they had ever heard before, a roaring, grinding cacophony that seemed to come from the earth itself. The lake, they would soon discover, was draining. And it was draining directly into the mine they had just escaped from. The growing vortex. Back at Lake Peigneur, the whirlpool that had swallowed the drilling rig was not diminishing. Instead, it was growing larger and more powerful with each passing minute. What had started as a localized disturbance where the rig had stood was now expanding outward, transforming the entire visible surface of the lake into a massive, rotating vortex. Witnesses who had gathered along the shore, including the drilling crew who had escaped and local residents who had heard the commotion and come to investigate, stood in stunned silence as they watched the impossible scene unfold before them. The lake was literally being sucked down into the earth, water spiraling inward toward a central point, moving faster and faster as the vortex grew. The physics of what was happening were simple in principle but devastating in execution. The 14-inch hole that the drill bit had created through the mine ceiling had immediately begun to erode. Lake water, under tremendous pressure from the weight of the water column above it, poured down through that hole with immense force. But salt dissolves in water rapidly and easily. The rushing water immediately began eating away at the salt surrounding the hole, making it larger. As the hole grew larger, more water could flow through it, and the increased flow dissolved even more salt, making the hole larger still. It was a feedback loop, a runaway process that accelerated exponentially. What had started as a 14-inch opening quickly became several feet across, then dozens of feet, then hundreds of feet, as the ceiling of the mine collapsed and the water eroded away everything it touched. All that water had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was Lake Peigneur. The entire lake was now being pulled downward into the mine, and the volume of water flowing was staggering. Estimates would later suggest that at the peak of the disaster, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 gallons of water per second were pouring into the mine, a flow rate comparable to a major river. The vortex had grown to perhaps a quarter-mile in diameter, a massive whirlpool that dominated the lake's surface. Water from all directions was being pulled toward the center, accelerating as it approached, spinning in a great spiral before plunging downward and disappearing. The sound was tremendous, a continuous roar like a waterfall, but deeper, more resonant, as if the earth itself were swallowing the lake with great gulping sounds. And it wasn't just water that was being pulled in. Everything on or near the lake was now at risk. Along the shore, trees that had stood for decades began to lean toward the lake. Their roots, anchored in the muddy soil, held for a while, but the suction from the vortex was relentless. One by one, cypresses and willows tilted further and further until their root systems could no longer hold against the pulling force. With great tearing sounds, root balls ripped free from the earth, and entire trees toppled toward the lake, sliding down the muddy banks and vanishing into the spinning water. The shoreline itself was beginning to collapse. The lake's edge had always been somewhat unstable, muddy and soft, but now large sections of the bank were simply giving way, slumping into the water in great wet chunks. Soil, grass, shrubs, everything was sliding lakeward, pulled by the same irresistible force that had taken the drilling rig. On the lake itself, several barges that had been moored near the shore began to move. These were large commercial vessels, used for transporting equipment and supplies, each weighing hundreds of tons when fully loaded. They had been secured with heavy chains to posts driven deep into the lake bottom, but against the power of the vortex, those chains might as well have been made of string. The first barge to break loose was a flat-bottomed vessel loaded with drilling mud and pipe. The chains snapped with sounds like gunshots, and the barge immediately began to move toward the whirlpool, slowly at first, then faster. It spun as it moved, caught in the rotating current, water sloshing over its edges. People on shore watched in horrified fascination as the enormous vessel was pulled inexorably toward the center of the vortex. When it reached the edge of the whirlpool proper, where the water descended most steeply, the barge tilted nose down, its forward end dipping into the spinning water. For a moment it seemed to pause there, balanced on the edge of the vortex, and then it simply slid forward and down, disappearing beneath the surface. One moment, a massive barge was visible. The next, there was only churning water where it had been. A second barge followed, then a third. One by one, the vessels that had been moored on the lake broke free and were dragged into the whirlpool. Some capsized as they were pulled in, rolling over in the turbulent water before vanishing. Others slid under intact, nose first, as if diving deliberately into the depths. A tugboat that had been docked nearby suffered the same fate. Its captain, fortunately, had not been aboard when the disaster began, but the vessel itself, tied to a dock that was already beginning to break apart, was pulled loose and began its fatal journey toward the center of the lake. The tugboat actually started its engine in an automatic response to the movement, its propeller churning, but against the force of the whirlpool, its engine was useless. The boat spun in circles as it was dragged along, finally tipping nearly vertical before disappearing bow first into the maelstrom. Loading docks, fishing piers, small boats, anything that had been on or very near the lake was now being consumed by the growing vortex. The lake that had been a peaceful body of water just hours ago had become a hungry mouth, devouring everything it could reach. And still the water poured down into the mine below, millions and millions of gallons, flooding the tunnels that the miners had so recently escaped, filling chamber after chamber with muddy lake water, dissolving salt walls and collapsing ceilings as it went. The mine was being destroyed, transformed from a dry, stable underground complex into a flooded, collapsed ruin. But the most dramatic destruction was yet to come, because the vortex was about to reach the shore of Jefferson Island, where the beautiful plantation grounds and gardens had stood for over a century. The land collapses. Jefferson Island, the highest ground around Lake Peigneur, had been a place of beauty for generations. The plantation home, Live Oak Gardens, sat on the slight elevation, surrounded by meticulously maintained botanical gardens that featured plants from around the world. Ancient live oak trees, their branches draped with Spanish moss, created shaded walkways. Camellias and azaleas bloomed in season. Peaceful ponds reflected the sky. It was a place of tranquility and natural beauty. But on November 20th, 1980, Jefferson Island was about to cease existing in any recognizable form. As the whirlpool expanded across the lake, it reached the northern shore where the island's gardens sloped gently down to the water's edge. The ground here was already unstable, undermined by the mine tunnels that ran beneath it, and as the vortex pulled at the shoreline, the land began to fail catastrophically. It started with trees nearest the water. As we've described, they tilted and fell, sliding into the lake. But behind those trees was more land, gardens and lawns and flower beds, and as the shoreline collapsed, that land went too, slumping downward in great waves of soil and vegetation. The collapse accelerated rapidly. What had been solid, ground one moment would crack and sink the next, opening fissures that quickly widened into yawning gaps. Entire sections of the garden, acres at a time, began sliding toward the lake, moving as unified masses like slow landslides, soil, plants, and trees, all tumbling together toward the hungry whirlpool. One of the most remarkable losses was the Botanical Gardens greenhouse complex. These were substantial structures, glass and metal buildings that housed tropical and exotic plants. As the ground beneath them began to move, the greenhouses tilted, their frames bending and glass shattering. Then, the earth opened up completely, and the entire complex, buildings and all, slid down into the lake and disappeared into the vortex. Thousands of rare plants, some of them decades old, were destroyed in seconds. The plantation home itself was not directly on the shore, but it was close enough to be in danger. As the collapse spread inland, massive cracks appeared in the lawns surrounding the house. The caretakers and any visitors who had been on the property had already fled when the disaster began, and it was fortunate they had, because the land literally fell away beneath where they had been standing. Geological surveys would later determine that approximately 65 acres of Jefferson Island, nearly all of the botanical gardens, and a significant portion of the estate grounds collapsed into Lake Peigneur that day. 65 acres, over 2.8 million square feet of land, simply ceased to exist as dry ground, sliding into the lake and being pulled down into the mine below, or settling into the crater that was forming where the lake had been. The destruction extended beyond just the immediate shoreline. The mine tunnels ran extensively under Jefferson Island, and as the lake water flooded those tunnels and the mine ceiling collapsed, the ground above subsided. Areas that had been solid land developed sinkholes and depressions. Trees that had stood on what seemed like stable ground suddenly found themselves leaning as the earth beneath their roots settled downward. Witnesses described hearing not just the roar of the water, but the groaning and cracking of the earth itself. It was a sound like thunder that didn't stop, a continuous rumbling punctuated by sharp cracks as large sections of land broke free and slid down. Dust rose in clouds where the ground fractured. Animals, deer, rabbits, smaller creatures fled in panic from the collapsing land, racing inland towards safety. One particularly dramatic loss was a stand of enormous live oak trees, some of them estimated to be over 200 years old. These massive trees, with trunks several feet in diameter and branches that spread out to create canopies of shade, had been landmarks on the island. They had survived hurricanes, floods, droughts, and the Civil War. But they could not survive what was happening now. One by one, as the ground beneath them collapsed, these ancient giants tilted and fell, crashing, down and sliding into the lake, their root balls the size of small houses ripped out of the earth. All of this, the land, the trees, the buildings, the gardens, tumbled down into the lake and was pulled into the whirlpool. Some of it likely ended up in the flooded mine tunnels below, washing through the underground passages in muddy torrents. Some of it probably settled in the lake bed as the water drained away. All of it was lost, destroyed in less than an hour, transforming Jefferson Island from a place of beauty into a scarred, broken landscape that would never be the same. And through all of this, the whirlpool continued to spin, the water continued to drain, and the mine continued to collapse beneath it all. The disaster had taken on a life of its own, a self-perpetuating cycle of destruction that wouldn't end until there was no more water left to drain from Lake Peigneur. But then something even more bizarre happened, something that no one watching could have anticipated. The flow of water reversed. The reversal Lake Peigneur was connected to the wider waterways of Louisiana by a canal, the Delcambre Canal, which ran from the lake southward to the Vermilion Bay and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico. Under normal circumstances, water flowed gently from the lake out through this canal, a peaceful current that barely moved, the lake draining slowly into the bay and being replenished by rainfall and runoff. But on November 20th, 1980, with the lake draining rapidly into the underground mine, the normal flow pattern was about to reverse in a dramatic and unprecedented way. As the water level in Lake Peigneur dropped, pulled down by the voracious whirlpool, it created a situation where the lake level was actually lower than the canal level. The canal, still connected to the bay and the Gulf, maintained its normal water level, but the lake was draining away, emptying out, and this created a difference in elevation between the two bodies of water. Water, following the basic laws of physics, flows from high elevation to low. And so the water in the canal, which had been flowing gently away from the lake, paused, stopped, and then began to flow backward, rushing from the canal back into the lake, trying to refill what was being drained away. At first, this reverse flow was relatively modest, just the nearby canal water responding to the changed conditions. But as the lake level dropped further and further, the effect intensified. The canal didn't just reverse, it began to rush backward with increasing speed and power, drawing more and more water from Vermilion Bay, which in turn drew water from the Gulf of Mexico itself. Within a short time, the Del Cambre Canal had been transformed from a sleepy waterway into a raging river flowing in the wrong direction. Water poured through the canal toward Lake Peigneur with the force and volume of a major rapid, creating actual standing waves and turbulent churning water where before there had been only calm. The effect was so pronounced that at the mouth of the canal where it met the lake, the rushing water created what was effectively a waterfall, an artificial cataract where the canal water dropped down into the lower basin of the lake and was immediately pulled into the ongoing whirlpool. It was a waterfall flowing backward into what had been a lake, a sight so unusual that there are few other examples of such a thing anywhere in recorded history. This reverse flow brought with it not fresh water, but salt water from the Gulf. As the canal drew from Vermilion Bay and the bay drew from the Gulf, ocean water began rushing up the canal and into Lake Peigneur. The lake, which had been a freshwater body for as long as anyone could remember, was now being refilled with salt water, completely changing its chemical composition. Boats that had been in the canal or the bay were caught by this reverse current and pulled along like leaves in a river. Several commercial fishing vessels were drawn toward the lake by the rushing water. Their captains, realizing what was happening, tried to motor away, engines straining against the current, but the flow was too powerful. Some boats were pulled all the way into the lake basin and caught by the lingering whirlpool effects, capsizing or being damaged in the turbulent water. The flow continued for hours, then days. Even after the main whirlpool had subsided and the most dramatic phase of the disaster was over, the canal continued to flow backward, bringing Gulf water into the crater where Lake Peigneur had been. The volume of water moving through the canal was estimated at some points to equal or exceed the flow of many natural rivers, all of it rushing in the wrong direction, all of it pouring into the collapsed basin. This created several remarkable and long-lasting effects. First, the lake, when it eventually stabilized, was no longer a freshwater lake at all. It had been transformed into a saltwater lake, with salinity levels similar to ocean water. Every organism that had lived in the fresh water, fish, plants, microorganisms, was killed off or driven out, and new saltwater species eventually colonized the lake over the following years. Second, the reverse flow through the canal created erosion and changed the canal's characteristics permanently. The rushing water scoured the canal bed and widened the channel in places. Navigation markers were displaced or destroyed. The canal, which had been a minor waterway, was now a significantly altered feature of the landscape. Third, the influx of Gulf water brought with it saltwater fish and other marine life. In the days and weeks following the disaster, fishermen reported finding ocean species in what had been Lake Peigneur, including saltwater fish, crabs, and other creatures that had been pulled up through the canal and deposited in the lake. The reversal of the canal flow lasted for approximately 3 days, finally stopping when the water levels equalized between the lake basin and the canal. By that time, the crater that had once been the bottom of shallow Lake Peigneur was filled with water again. But it was water that had come from the Gulf of Mexico, salt water that had flowed backward through the canal in one of the most bizarre hydrological events ever documented. And in all of this chaos, in all of this incredible destruction and transformation, perhaps the most remarkable fact was this: no one had died. Not a single person lost their life in the Lake Peigneur disaster, despite the tremendous forces involved, despite the violence of the collapse, despite the completely unprecedented nature of the event. The miraculous survival. When discussing the Lake Peigneur disaster, the most extraordinary aspect is not what was destroyed, but what was saved. 55 people were directly involved in the events of that day: the drilling crew on the rig, the miners underground, and various other workers and residents in the immediate area. Every single one of them survived. This perfect survival rate was not luck alone, though certainly fortune played its role. It was the result of multiple factors coming together at exactly the right moments: good timing, quick thinking, proper training, and yes, a considerable amount of luck. Consider first the drilling crew on the rig. These men had only moments to recognize that something was catastrophically wrong and to make the decision to abandon their expensive equipment and run for their lives. That they did so immediately, without hesitation, without trying to troubleshoot the problem or save the machinery, was crucial. Had they delayed even a few minutes, they would have been on the rig when it was pulled into the whirlpool, and their chances of survival would have been minimal. The fact that they had a boat readily available was also fortunate. Drilling rigs don't always have immediate access to watercraft, but this one did, tied up and ready to use. The crew was able to get into that boat and row to shore in the brief window of time before the rig was destroyed. A few more minutes of delay, and they would have been dumped into the churning water when the rig went down. Now consider the miners. 50 men were underground when the disaster began, working in various parts of the mine spread across a large area. The mine was a maze of tunnels covering hundreds of acres underground. Getting everyone out safely under normal circumstances would take time. Getting everyone out during an emergency, with limited warning and no clear understanding of what the danger was, should have been nearly impossible. Several factors saved the miners. First was the timing. The disaster occurred during a shift change period, meaning there were fewer men underground than there would have been at the height of a regular work shift. At full operation, there might have been twice as many people in the mine, making evacuation even more difficult. Second was the location of the workers. By pure chance, none of the mining crews were working in the areas of the mine that would be flooded first. The water from the lake didn't spread evenly through the tunnel system. It followed the paths of least resistance, pouring through some passages while initially leaving others relatively dry. The miners happened to be in sections that weren't immediately inundated, giving them precious minutes to evacuate. Third was the quality of the mine's emergency procedures and the discipline of the workforce. When the evacuation order was given, the miners didn't panic or argue or waste time asking questions. They immediately moved toward the exits, following the procedures they had practiced. The foreman maintained order, checked to make sure everyone was accounted for, and ensured that no one was left behind. Fourth was the robustness of the mine's infrastructure. The elevators continued to function during the crucial evacuation period. The lights stayed on. The emergency ladders were in place and accessible. Had any of these systems failed, the result could have been tragic, but everything worked as it was designed to, giving the miners the means to escape. Fifth, and perhaps most remarkably, was the timing of the mine ceiling collapse. The structural failure that allowed the lake to drain into the mine didn't happen instantly. The 14-inch hole created by the drill bit took several minutes to erode into a larger opening, and the ceiling collapse progressed gradually rather than catastrophically. This gave the miners enough warning, enough time to recognize danger and evacuate before the water reached them in force. Several of the miners later reported hearing water in the tunnels as they evacuated, and some saw the beginnings of flooding in the lowest sections of the mine. But the water never caught up to them. The last men out reached the surface just ahead of the flood that would completely inundate the mine behind them. On the surface, the fact that no one was on the barges that were pulled into the whirlpool was simply a matter of timing and normal work schedules. The vessels were unmanned at that hour of the morning. Had the disaster occurred at a different time of day, there might well have been crews aboard those barges, and their survival would have been unlikely. Similarly, the collapse of Jefferson Island's gardens and grounds occurred after everyone had evacuated the area. The first signs of trouble, the whirlpool, and the sinking of the drilling rig gave sufficient warning that people cleared out of the immediate area. By the time acres of land were sliding into the lake, there was no one left in danger of going with it. Even the boats that were pulled backward through the canal, caught by the reverse flow from the Gulf, managed to survive intact. The captains ran their vessels aground on the sides of the canal or managed to break free from the current before being drawn into the worst of the turbulent water at the lake. It could easily have gone differently, with boats capsizing and crews being thrown into the churning water. But it didn't. Time after time, throughout the disaster, the circumstances aligned in ways that spared human life. The warnings came just early enough. The evacuations happened just quickly enough. People made the right decisions at the right moments, and the disaster, for all its violence and destruction, never quite caught anyone in its grip. It's worth reflecting on how easily this could have been a tragedy of immense proportions. If the drill bit had punched through the mine ceiling at night, with miners scattered throughout the complex working their shift, with no daylight to aid evacuation, the outcome might have been very different. If the rig crew had been slower to react, trying to understand what was happening rather than immediately fleeing, they would have been doomed. If the mine's evacuation procedures had been less practiced or the miners less disciplined, people could have been lost in the confusion of the underground chaos. But none of those things happened. Every factor that could have gone wrong instead went right, or at least went right enough. The result was a disaster that destroyed millions of dollars worth of equipment, transformed a lake, swallowed acres of land, and made headlines around the world, yet hurt no one. It remains one of the most remarkable survival stories in the history of industrial disasters, a case study in how proper training, quick thinking, good timing, and yes, considerable luck can mean the difference between catastrophe and miracle. The aftermath. When the waters finally stopped flowing and the chaos subsided, what remained was almost unrecognizable. Lake Peigneur, that shallow freshwater lake that had existed for generations, was simply gone. In its place was a deep saltwater basin, fundamentally altered in every way. The numbers tell part of the story. The lake, which had been typically around 10 feet deep, now had areas that exceeded 400 feet in depth. The simple shallow basin had been transformed into a deep crater filled with water from the Gulf of Mexico. The surface area had changed too, with the collapse of shoreline and the creation of new contours as the land settled into new configurations. The Diamond Crystal Salt Mine was completely destroyed. The tunnels, chambers, and pillars that had taken over 50 years to excavate were now flooded, collapsed, or both. The mine would never operate again. The company's investment, the infrastructure, the equipment, everything underground was a total loss. The salt that remained in the ground was effectively unrecoverable, trapped below hundreds of feet of water and collapsed rock. On Jefferson Island, the botanical gardens that had been a source of pride and beauty were largely destroyed. Some portions of the estate grounds that hadn't collapsed entirely were left scarred and unusable, cut through with cracks and subsidence features. The Ape plantation home survived, being far enough from the worst of the collapse, but it looked out over a dramatically changed landscape where once beautiful gardens had been replaced by rough, broken ground and disturbed earth. The environmental impact was significant. A freshwater ecosystem that had existed for centuries was completely eliminated. Every fish, every plant, every organism adapted to fresh water was killed off when the lake was replaced with saltwater from the Gulf. It would take years for a new saltwater ecosystem to establish itself in the transformed lake. The barges, the drilling rig, the tugboat, boats, docks, and other equipment that had been pulled into the whirlpool were gone, either crushed in the collapse, buried in the flooded mine, or settling somewhere in the deep bottom of the new lake. Some of this debris would never be recovered, becoming permanent fixtures of the lake bottom, artificial reefs in the salt water. The economic impact spread beyond the immediate area. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company lost its mine and its investment. The Wilson Brothers Corporation lost their drilling rig and faced massive liability issues. Property owners around the lake saw their land values plummet. The local economy, which had depended partly on the mine for employment and on the lake for recreation and fishing, was disrupted. But perhaps most significant was the psychological impact on the community. The people who lived around Lake Peigneur had lost something fundamental: their sense of permanence and stability. The lake that had always been there, that had been part of their landscape for their entire lives, and their parents' lives, and their grandparents' lives, was gone, replaced by something alien and different. It was as if the earth itself had proven untrustworthy, capable of swallowing familiar things without warning. The investigation. In the days and weeks following the disaster, investigators descended on the site to try to understand exactly what had happened and why. Engineers, geologists, mining experts, drilling consultants, and regulatory officials all wanted answers. How could a routine drilling operation have caused such catastrophic results? The investigation revealed a chain of errors and miscalculations that led to the disaster. At the heart of it was a mistake in the drilling coordinates. The Wilson Brothers Corporation had been provided with maps showing the extent of the Diamond Crystal Salt Mine's underground workings, and they were supposed to use these maps to ensure their drill hole didn't intersect with any mine tunnels. But somewhere in the process of planning the drill site, an error was made. Either the maps were misread, or the coordinates were recorded incorrectly, or calculations about the drill hole's path were wrong. Different theories emerged, and the exact source of the error became a matter of legal dispute. What was certain was that the drilling rig had been set up directly over a portion of the mine, and as the drill bit angled downward, it had intersected with one of the mine tunnels. The position of the drill hole relative to the mine was critical. It didn't just penetrate the ceiling of some unimportant side tunnel. It punched through into a main access corridor, a large passage that connected to many other parts of the mine. This meant that when water began pouring in, it had direct access to spread throughout the tunnel system. Moreover, the geology of the area made the situation worse. The ceiling of the mine in that area was relatively thin, perhaps only 100 to 150 feet of salt and other rock separating the mine from the lake bottom. This ceiling was already supporting significant stress from the weight of the water above, and when the drill bit punctured it, the structural integrity was compromised. The rapid erosion of salt was another key factor. Salt dissolves readily in fresh water, and the lake water pouring through the initial hole immediately began eating away at the surrounding salt walls and ceiling. What started as a 14-inch opening quickly grew to several feet, then dozens of feet, as the rushing water dissolved everything it touched. The feedback loop that developed was devastating. More water flow meant more erosion, which meant a larger hole, which allowed more water flow, which caused more erosion, and so on. There was no natural break on this process, no way for it to stabilize until the lake was either empty or the mine was completely flooded. Investigators also examined why the disaster had occurred without more warning signs. Shouldn't there have been some indication that the drill bit was approaching a large void underground? The answer was complex. The drilling crew did notice some anomalies, changes in the drilling characteristics that might have suggested they were nearing a cavity. But these signs were subtle and could have multiple interpretations. By the time they realized something was seriously wrong, the bit had already penetrated the mine ceiling. The question of responsibility became a contentious legal issue. Who was at fault? The drilling company for making the coordinate error and drilling in the wrong location. The salt company for not providing more accurate maps or ensuring that drilling in the area was properly monitored. The regulatory agencies for not having stricter oversight of drilling operations near mines. These questions would be argued in courts for years. Multiple lawsuits were filed. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company sued the drilling company for the destruction of their mine. Property owners sued for the loss of their land. The drilling company's insurance companies fought over liability. Settlement amounts eventually totaled more than $45 million, though the legal wrangling continued for much of the decade. Lessons learned. The Lake Peigneur disaster, despite its bizarre nature and the fortunate lack of casualties, provided important lessons for multiple industries. In the immediate aftermath, drilling companies and mining operations around the world took notice, recognizing that coordination between surface drilling and underground mining needed to be much more rigorous. One key lesson was the importance of accurate spatial data. Knowing exactly where underground voids are located in 3 dimensions and ensuring that this data is accurately transferred to drilling operations became a critical focus. Mapping technology and surveying techniques were improved in the years following the disaster, with the goal of preventing similar coordinate errors. Communication between different industrial operations in the same area was also emphasized. The drilling company and the mining company should have been in much closer contact, sharing information about their operations and ensuring mutual awareness of each other's activities. After Lake Peigneur, many jurisdictions implemented requirements for such coordination, mandating that surface drilling operations notify and coordinate with any underground mining in the area. The disaster also highlighted the incredible speed with which such events can unfold. From the moment the drill bit penetrated the mine ceiling to the complete drainage of the lake took only a few hours. This rapidity reinforced the importance of immediate evacuation procedures and the need for workers to be trained to respond instantly to warning signs, even when they don't fully understand what's happening. For mine safety in general, Lake Peigneur became a case study in the value of emergency preparedness. The diamond crystal mine's evacuation procedures, which had been practiced regularly, saved 50 lives that day. The disaster demonstrated that having plans on paper isn't enough. Workers need to practice those plans until they become second nature, so that in a genuine emergency, people react correctly, even under stress. Environmental agencies also took lessons from the disaster, particularly regarding the vulnerability of ecosystems. The complete transformation of Lake Peigneur from a freshwater to a saltwater environment demonstrated how quickly ecosystems could be destroyed by industrial accidents. This led to greater emphasis on environmental risk assessment for industrial operations near sensitive areas. Geologists and engineers studied the disaster to better understand the mechanics of catastrophic subsidence and collapse. The events at Lake Peigneur provided real-world data about how underground voids respond to sudden inundation, how salt dissolves under high-flow conditions, and how surface features respond to the loss of underground support. This knowledge improved the ability to predict and model similar scenarios elsewhere. Insurance companies and risk assessors also learned from Lake Peigneur. The disaster demonstrated that even seemingly low-risk routine operations can, through a combination of errors, produce catastrophic results. This led to more sophisticated risk modeling that takes into account not just individual hazards, but the potential for cascading failures. Perhaps most broadly, Lake Peigneur became an example of how human errors, even small ones, can be amplified by natural processes into disasters. A coordinate error of perhaps a few hundred feet led to the destruction of a lake, a mine, acres of land, and millions of dollars in property. It was a reminder that in industrial operations, especially those dealing with powerful natural forces, there is often little margin for error. The recovery. In the months and years following the disaster, the area around Lake Peigneur gradually stabilized and began a slow recovery, though nothing would ever return to the way it had been before November 20th, 1980. The lake itself settled into a new equilibrium. The crater filled with Gulf water to approximately the same level as it had been before, but the depth and salinity were permanently changed. Over time, saltwater species colonized the lake, establishing a new ecosystem that was fundamentally different from what had existed before. Fishermen adapted to the new conditions, learning to fish for saltwater species in what had been a freshwater lake. The shoreline stabilized, though it was now in a different location in many places, and the edges of the collapsed areas remained as reminders of what had been lost. Some of the subsidence features and cracks in the ground around Jefferson Island gradually softened and filled in, while others remained visible as permanent scars in the landscape. Jefferson Island's botanical gardens were partially restored over the years, though not to their original extent. Some areas that had collapsed were simply left as altered terrain, too damaged or unstable to rebuild. The plantation home, Live Oak Gardens, continued to operate as a tourist attraction, though its gardens were forever diminished from their former glory. The community around the lake adapted to the new reality. People rebuilt their lives, found new employment where the mine jobs had disappeared, and gradually accepted that Lake Peigneur was now something different. Stories of the disaster became part of local lore, passed down through families, a dramatic tale of the day the lake was swallowed by the earth. For the workers who had been present that day, the drilling crew who escaped the rig, and the miners who evacuated underground, the event remained a defining moment in their lives. Many gave interviews over the years, describing their experiences, the terror and confusion of those moments, and their gratitude at having survived. Some suffered from anxiety or nightmares related to the event, while others seemed to process it more easily, viewing it as an incredible story they happened to be part of. The drilling rig and barges that were pulled into the lake were never recovered. They remain somewhere in the depths, perhaps buried in collapsed mine tunnels, perhaps resting on the lake bottom, permanent. Reminders of what happened. Occasionally, sonar surveys of the lake detect what might be pieces of the lost equipment, but no serious attempt has ever been made to salvage them. The Diamond Crystal Salt Company never reopened the mine. The flooding and collapse had been too complete, the damage too extensive. The company eventually closed its operations in the area entirely, writing off the loss and moving on to other ventures. The mine entrances were sealed and the surface facilities were dismantled and removed. As the years passed, the immediate memories of the disaster began to fade, though the physical changes to the landscape remained. New generations grew up around Lake Peigneur, knowing it only as a saltwater lake, unaware that their grandparents had fished for freshwater bass in those same waters. The disaster became history, a strange and dramatic story from the past. But for those who were there, for those who witnessed the whirlpool and the collapsing land and the incredible sight of an entire lake draining into the earth, it remained vivid and immediate, a day when the impossible became real and survival felt like a miracle. Now, as we come to the end of this remarkable story, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. We've journeyed through one of the most bizarre disasters in American history, watching as a simple mistake created a catastrophic chain reaction, as ordinary workers faced impossible choices in mere seconds, and as 55 people somehow escaped what should have been certain death. We've seen how Lake Peigneur, that peaceful, shallow lake, was transformed in just hours into something completely different. We've witnessed the drilling rig topple and disappear, barges pulled into a massive whirlpool, acres of beautiful gardens sliding into churning water. We've descended into the salt mine and climbed back out with the evacuating miners. We've watched water flow backward through a canal, reversing the normal course of nature. And through it all, we've marveled at the extraordinary fact that no one died. Every person who was present that day, every worker, every resident in the area, survived to tell their story. It was a combination of quick thinking, proper training, good timing, and yes, considerable luck. But survive they did, and in that survival, there is hope and inspiration. As you settle in now, as the story fades and sleep approaches, let the images of rushing water and collapsing land recede into the distance. Let the tension of those desperate evacuations ease from your shoulders. Let the miracle of survival, the knowledge that even in the face of nature's most bizarre and terrifying demonstrations, human life can prevail, bring you comfort and peace. The lake is calm now, though changed. The mine is quiet, though flooded. The land has settled, though scarred. And the people, those remarkable people who lived through that impossible day, have carried on with their lives, stronger for having survived, grateful for every moment they were given. Rest now, knowing that even when the earth itself seems to open up beneath us, even when lakes drain away and reality becomes strange and terrifying, the human spirit can endure. The disaster has passed. The danger is gone. And in the calm that follows, there is peace, there is rest, there is the gentle embrace of sleep. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most unusual disasters. If you found this story fascinating, please like and subscribe for more historical explorations. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or any other disasters you'd like to hear about. And now, let the tale of Lake Peigneur drift away like water finding its level as you sink into deep, restful, restorative sleep. The whirlpool has stopped spinning. The waters are still, and all is well.